Well, good morning. Welcome. We're so excited to see all of you coming. I know more folks are going to be coming into the room, but wanted to respect your time and get started. My name is Sarah Clark. I'm the Senior Director of Strategy and Development for Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University, also called EdSystems. And we are thrilled to welcome you to the public launch of our policy agenda. This is the first policy agenda that we've put together in a formal presentation in EdSystems' 13-year history. But throughout our existence, we've been very involved in policy work, as many of you know. We take a bi-directional approach, trying to learn with local and regional leaders about what's working and what's needed on the ground, and elevating those learning up to state spaces and tables. And that work is continuing, as you'll hear today. But as Northern Illinois University, our work really is to support our partners, right? We take a technical assistance approach to this work, and you'll hear in Emily's presentation that we see a lot of opportunities to continue with EdSystems' mission to create clear and unambiguous paths for learners to advance both in college and career spaces. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Director of Policy, Emily Reska. Good morning, Emily.
Everyone. It's really such a pleasure to be here with all of you. It's really incredible seeing a lot of friendly names in the list and a lot of new names to me, representing really quite the span of education and policy work in the state. So just really such a pleasure to be here. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Emily Ruska. I'm our Director of Policy at EdSystems, and really thrilled to be launching our policy agenda with you all today. So just to get us started here, I'm going to give a little bit of background around our approach and why we are launching a policy agenda now. You know, as we are 1 week into a new federal administration, it is even more essential for us to home in on what we can be doing at a state level to really drive college and career preparation for young people all over Illinois, and really work to align our systems. We've got a lot of power in the state, a lot of funding that is driven by state decisions. And so we have a lot of opportunities to build on a lot of great work that's already been happening in the state, both at local levels and certainly across our state agency and other statewide leaders in Illinois. So in our process, we really wanted to start with what are the challenges that we're hearing about in the field. We do a lot of work with practitioners around the state, as Sarah mentioned. We do a lot of work with state agency leaders and other advocacy and policy partners in the state and nationally. And we really grounded ourselves in what are the challenges that we are seeing, both in examining quantitative and qualitative data, as well as anecdotally that we're hearing from our partners across the state and nationally. We spent some time really synthesizing what those challenges were. We identified a handful of core themes that have really driven the levers that I'll describe in a minute here. And we've worked on churning those ideas and refining them through looking at data further. Once we identified what those challenges were to guide our work, we decided to say, what are the conditions that we want to be working towards? What are those aims that we want to articulate? What are the things that we want to be true about our education and workforce systems broadly in the state that we can be working towards in each of those kind of core focal areas, the levers that I'll describe? And we got feedback from some critical friends in Illinois and nationally, amongst our state agency partners, amongst other policy and advocacy organizations, practitioners, et cetera. And ultimately, what we have created here that I'll lay out in the following slides and presentation, as well as in a narrative format that is available on our website now, is a policy agenda that both grapples with the challenges that we're currently seeing in our systems and the ways in which we can work together alongside our critical partners that are on the line here and who might not be able to join us this morning to really advance equitable opportunities for young people in Illinois and really ensure that our systems are doing what we hope that they can achieve in working in alignment and making things easier for young people to navigate our systems. So thank you for joining us for this public launch. We're really thrilled to be doing this today. Before I dive into the core levers, I want to lay out a handful of cross-cutting principles that have really bubbled up in our work that kept on coming up as we grappled with each of the distinct levers that I'll describe. And we wanted to call out really specifically. These are our sort of guiding principles around how we want to be driving towards more equitable systems in Illinois and beyond. The first of which is that the burden should be shifted away from students and families and onto the system as much as possible. What I mean by that is that young people should not be bearing the burden of navigation. Our system should be easily navigable, should encourage student transitions and progression through their pathways, and really should be easy to access as much as possible. Secondly, that our system should be really designed collaboratively. This is core to that bidirectional approach Sarah mentioned. We think it's really essential that practitioners and leaders from across our systems can weigh in and collaborate to design our systems and ground those systems in robust data, both quantitative and qualitative. And we want to emphasize that that should include student voice. You know, the systems that are being designed for students should be informed by students themselves. And finally, core undergirding principle of equity, that student demography, geography, and resources should not correlate with access and outcomes. It should not be a predestination for a student, depending on where they are coming from, where they will end up. So with that, I will introduce our 4 policy levers, our policy agenda pillars, I should say. So we've got our 4 pillars here, and I'll describe each of them briefly, and then I will go through each of these 4 pillars and describe the challenges that we have summarized in each of these areas. I will describe the aims that we've articulated for each of them and a handful of policy levers that we think can be potentially powerful in driving towards them. So these 4 pillars, again, were really deeply informed by us examining the challenges that we're seeing in the field, both through examination of data as well as discussions with our core partners. Please feel free to add reactions and questions and reflections in the chat. I know Sarah's keeping a close eye on that. We've also got the Q&A function open if that's easier for folks. So our 4 pillars here are 1, leadership, governance, and vision, right? These are core describing factors in our systems, right? So how do we leverage our leadership and governance and vision in the state to design equitable policy, to drive towards equitable outcomes for young people? How do we shape what's possible through those different components of our system? The second pillar here is student experience and conditions. How are students experiencing our P20 pipeline throughout the pipeline? What are their experiences like? How are they faring? And how do they feel about it? What's their input? What are the barriers that they may be experiencing in their navigation of that pipeline? The third pillar is policy evaluation and continuous improvement. We always want to be making sure that our policies and practices are aligned with the goals that we have. So can we examine our policies and determine if they are having the outcomes or generating the outcomes that we intended? Do we have adequate data resources to examine equity and capacity for continuous improvement? And then finally, the final pillar is future readiness, right? So we've got a lot of change always happening. I feel like in the last week, we've experienced a lot of change already, right? How do we anticipate changes to our world and our systems? And how do we design policy that prepares young people to adapt and thrive in those conditions as they evolve, both technologically and experientially? So again, I will go through each of these 4 pillars and I will describe the challenges that we see, the aims that we have, and some of the levers that we have identified in each of these areas. I'll name that the levers that I'll describe are not meant to be the only things that we will potentially work on at EdSystems. We recognize that there's a really essential role for us to partner with other leaders throughout the P20 pipeline and throughout the policy and advocacy space to really work together in our different lanes of expertise to drive towards the aims that we've articulated, and that there's a lot of other work that will be happening and that may bubble up over time that can help drive towards these aims.
Emily, as you continue, I wanted to jump in with a great question from Jean Marie. She's asking basically for a definition around what we mean by young people. Who are we thinking about in this work?
Yeah, so I mean, at EdSystems, we tend to focus on the secondary to post-secondary transition space, right? So we are largely speaking about high school students into that early college, early employment range. So the kind of 16 to 24 range tends, or the, I guess, 14 to 24 range tends to be about the right range for us. Although I welcome Sarah correcting me and expanding that range. We certainly work with partners that sort of dip earlier on into the P20 pipeline, and we certainly work with partners who are more heavily emphasizing later parts of the post-secondary pipeline as well. Great question. So thank you for pausing me on that front. Okay, so with that, I will dive in on our first pillar here. So leadership, governance, and vision. And again, I will start by describing some of the core challenges that we see in our state. The first of these challenges that we've articulated here is a lack of a shared vision. We are in 2025, we've had the 60 by 2025 goal, 60% of Illinois adults having a high quality post-secondary degree or credential by 2025. That goal has been in place since 2009 for the state. And we're now in 2025, and largely we will have met the 60 by 25 overall goal. It doesn't look the same depending on demographic groups. It doesn't have built-in sort of equity targets. And we think that while there's a lot of robust collaboration across state agencies and across practitioners in different parts of the pipeline, we really would benefit from a shared vision that can help drive equitable cross-system initiatives that enhance college and career readiness and success. The second challenge area that we've identified here is that there are gaps in the pipeline, right? So there are lots of different levers at play. There's lots of different roles and responsibilities, and particularly in spaces that require cross collaboration across different parts of the system, whether that's secondary and post-secondary institutions or community-based organizations, et cetera, particularly transitional spaces, that learners are experiencing a leaky pipeline in part because roles and responsibilities about who is handling what aspects of those transitions or aspects of those areas for alignment vary widely across the state. They are prioritized differently depending on funding, depending on different pressures locally. And so that leads to some inconsistencies in terms of what young people are experiencing in our system. And then the final challenge area that we've articulated here in the leadership, governance, and vision pillar is that our workforce is stressed, right? We have a lot of turnover, both at a statewide level as well as locally. And that inconsistency in capacity and staffing can really impact the ability of leaders to implement the strategies that are being developed effectively. You lose institutional knowledge sometimes, you lose some relationships that have critically bridged certain organizations, and that ends up meaning that the experience of the workforce ends up trickling down to the experience of the learners. So what are we aiming for in terms of leadership, governance, and vision in the state in this pillar? One of them is defining a North Star, like I alluded to on the previous slide. We think it would be really valuable for our Illinois education and workforce leaders to hold a clear, shared vision for equitable economic mobility that increases learner access, retention, and success throughout the P20 pipeline. I'll describe this a little bit further on the next slide, but the reason why we're centering in on economic mobility is because it's to drive towards attainment, education, et cetera, but to what end, right? What is the point of encouraging folks to progress along their pathway, pursuing additional education and training? How can we organize, how can various people throughout the P20 pipeline organize their work under a guiding North Star that can be around economic mobility? The second aim we have in this area is around coordination of the ecosystem, right? So we would love to see a coordinated ecosystem of state and local education and workforce leaders that are collaborating to develop, implement, and evaluate college and career readiness policy. And importantly, that includes clear and consistent codification of roles and funding to support those intermediary functions, right? So to help bridge those gaps and those definitional challenges that we sometimes see in the field. So what are some of the levers that we think can help us achieve these core aims in leadership, governance, and vision? One, we are advancing an idea around having a governor's education cabinet. Many are familiar with the Illinois P20 Council, which currently is largely focused on some discrete areas of focus. They've kind of been focusing on some discrete issue areas. What we're proposing here is saying that there needs to be some real statewide leadership that is holding the whole system together, that is holding the vision for the whole system, and recognizing that we need to keep an eye in particular on transition spaces. So importantly, what we don't mean by this is just state agencies being at the table. We think it's essential for this type of statewide body to be representative of practitioners and leaders at all levels throughout our P20 system in the state. And that there can be some discrete issue areas that are of particular focus, like I said, particularly transition points for young people, so that given that it requires a lot of important collaboration and guidance for those kind of points in the system, how can we continue to advance this collaborative work and vision at a statewide level? The second lever here is a statewide vision for economic mobility. Again, we want to emphasize economic mobility and equitable economic mobility because we think it's essential to focus in on the ultimate outcome that we're hoping to see. What are the things that we're hoping to be true for people who are navigating our systems in Illinois? And what do we hope for their ultimate potential and outcomes to be? We think that economic mobility can be a real organizing principle for not only education, but also there's implications for workforce. So how can folks see across the system, see how their work fits into this broader statewide vision? How do they tie to a statewide vision that is progressing, supporting folks to progress through the P20 pipeline and really succeed not only in just attaining education credentials or workforce credentials, but really succeeding in accessing high quality jobs that are enabling them to sustain their families and to advance in their world. The third lever here is funding. We know we're in a resource constrained environment. We're not necessarily talking about new funding here, but thinking about, when the principle is what gets funded gets done, how do we think about existing funding streams in ways that can help us support the types of functions, including the facilitation that intermediaries play across the state, the collaboration that's required, particularly in transition space? How do we drive funding in ways that can help support that collaboration and really incentivize it in order to drive a more aligned system more broadly? So our next pillar area is student experience and conditions. Again, this is about how are students experiencing our systems, what barriers might they be experiencing, how do they feel about their experience, et cetera. So the core challenges that we've articulated here is one, that we have to name that even though EdSystems may not work on every single thing that might impact education, that there are lots of systems and forces that are outside of the education system that do in fact deeply shape how students access and succeed or experience challenges in the opportunities available to them, right? Particularly in college and career readiness. We are not necessarily a poverty alleviation organization, but poverty, transportation, other systemic challenges like that really do significantly impact how young people experience our systems. And we need to acknowledge that and grapple with that often when we're trying to drive towards more equitable access and outcomes. Secondly, we often see a culture of gatekeeping, right? Students are making decisions based on certainly information that they receive, and so it's important that they receive both quality and timely information, but they are also making decisions that is grounded in broader school and community culture and what they experience through adults who are shaping their decisions, right? The adults who may act as gatekeepers intentionally or unintentionally, often unintentionally, arguably. And I would say, we've heard this time and time again when engaging with young people to ask about why they did or did not take advantage of certain college and career preparation opportunities. And there are frequent examples of students saying, well, I was qualified for a dual credit course, but I was advised against it by certain adults within the building, whether that was a teacher or an advisor or even a family member sometimes, right? So there's different types of messaging that are happening, that's happening for students that we need to grapple with as well. We also see sort of inconsistencies in terms of policies and practice around placement into college and career readiness opportunities. By this, we mean transitional instruction, dual credit, work-based learning. There's varying practices and policies around what means a student should be accessing those opportunities. And that can reinforce existing inequities that are often shaped already by student demography, geography, and resources. And that means widening gaps for students ultimately. And that's not something that we want to be supporting. We want to be dismantling those types of barriers. The final challenge that we've articulated in this area is around scheduling, and that is both at a systems level and for students themselves. We often hear from secondary school districts in particular that there are so many graduation requirements, it's really difficult to make sure they are able to offer the full breadth of opportunities to their students and ensuring that they are able to complete all their graduation requirements. There's just not enough hours in the day, we hear often. And from the student standpoint, we often hear that a lot of these types of opportunities, more robust work-based learning, more robust early college credit opportunities, et cetera, are very concentrated in the junior and senior year of high school. And that can make it challenging to balance taking advantage of those types of opportunities alongside other important priorities and responsibilities that they may have at home or just in their life, extracurriculars, et cetera. So what are our aims in terms of student experience and conditions? First, we want students to have equitable experiences. We want all Illinois learners to be provided adequate resources, advising, and support to ensure that they're prepared for and accelerated into college and career opportunities that are importantly aligned to their interests and growing skills, not just kind of pushing students down a pathway that may not be aligned to their interests and skills, but that we're really grounding in what students are interested in and growing in. Secondly, we want to see more aligned and streamlined systems, right? So what we want to see Illinois secondary and post-secondary systems using clear, equitable, evidence-based, and aligned placement policies and practices that are maximizing student acceleration throughout the pipeline. And this builds from a lot of movement in the state around automatic acceleration, et cetera, really wanting to focus in on what does it mean to accelerate through that pipeline and really ground ourselves in a belief in student potential and student success, and let that guide our policy with adequate resources and support for students to really achieve that advancement. So again, what are some of our levers here? And again, I'll just note for everyone here, we are not a legislative advocacy organization. We provide thought partnership to policy and advocacy partners in the state. We do not do any legislative advocacy explicitly as an organization. Certainly, there are things that may relate to existing or emerging legislative work, but that's not something that that's not a type of lever that we directly work on as an organization. We can provide subject matter expertise. And so what we're trying to say here is what are the types of things that we would want to see? And often there are things that can be driven by state agency leadership and decision making. So that's sort of the lens that we come to. And I apologize for not naming that earlier. So what are the policy levers that we're describing here in the student experience and conditions? So if we're aiming towards a system that has adequate resources for students to succeed, and if we're aiming for a system that is sort of grounded in a belief in student potential, what do we need? One, we need to fund a learner-ready system, right? So that means how do we figure out how to use our existing funding streams to better provide student supports in an equitable way, reaching students where they're at and providing the supports that they may need? How do we systemically invest in teacher professional development and supports to help enable more teachers to be ready to offer dual credit, right? We often feel a pinch in terms of the teacher pipeline, and particularly in certain subject matter areas, certainly in dual credit, we often see that. How do we more systematically invest in that workforce and supporting that workforce to being ready for and qualified for offering early college credit opportunities? The second lever is around increasing portability for pathway experiences. We have for example, the College and Career Pathway endorsement in the state, which is designated on the high school diploma for students completing a set of courses and hands-on learning experiences. We've been working at EdSystems on currency for that with community colleges around the state. But there's a lot of movement toward or questions around what else will this help students do in the long term, or what are the things that can be more consistent statewide? And so what we've started to think about is how can these principles around portability, which is guiding around transfer, et cetera, how can we apply that to pathways experiences? How can the work-based learning experiences that a young person is having at the high school level help inform and accelerate them in their post-secondary opportunities, both in education and employment? How can their early college opportunities and the other preparation that they're doing early on in the pipeline carry forward with them at the post-secondary level in education and employment? The final lever that we've got here is around creating more seamless college admissions. There's a few different initiatives happening in the state right now around streamlining college admissions processes, and that's at sort of for different different subgroups of potential incoming students for our post-secondary system. And so what we mean by that is anything, all of those sorts of levers around making that experience more seamless. How do we assume that students can and should be able to progress through their pipeline? How do we make it easier for students and families to access post-secondary education, reducing the barriers, supporting them to succeed in that, including things like leveraging the FAFSA graduation requirement, FAFSA completion graduation requirement, to align that with community college admissions, since we have open admissions at our community college. What are the different ways that we can make a more seamless transition for students from secondary to and through post-secondary, particularly as we face a demographic cliff with post-secondary enrollment. Post-secondary enrollment, new NSC data, National Student Clearinghouse data released last week, indicates that overall nationally there's some increase in post-secondary enrollment, but we are facing a cliff in terms of the number of young people who are progressing up through our systems. And so as we grapple with that coming down the pipeline, how do we make it easier to access post-secondary education with adequate supports for folks to be ready, for students to be ready for that experience as well? Our third lever area here we've got is policy evaluation and continuous improvement. So the core challenges that we see in this area are, one, we don't necessarily have enough evaluation that's happened around our policies and practices so far in the state. We've got a lot of robust college and career readiness policy in the state, actually, with the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act, the Dual Credit Quality Act, and other really core pieces of legislation and state plans. But we don't necessarily have a robust set of evaluations that tell us, yes, this lever is working in the way that we wanted it to. And so we need to have more evaluations that can help us get under the hood of how both implementation and the design of the policy itself really shape who's accessing, what implementation is looking like, who's accessing those levers, and what's ultimately happening with the folks who are experiencing those policies. Two, we have some gaps in data, right? So we have a lot of robust data resources like the Illinois report card, the Illinois post-secondary profiles, et cetera, but we sometimes lack consistent and quality and actionable data, right? In terms of implementation, participation, and outcomes data. And that's both statewide and locally. And that could mean that we have certain measures, but we don't have them in a disaggregated fashion, right? For example, community college remediation is reported on the Illinois report card, but it's not reported in a disaggregated way. So it makes it difficult to examine sort of equity differences or differences across different demographic groups for students. We don't always have data that are connected to one another, so we can't necessarily longitudinally look at those different data and examine what's happening throughout a pipeline. Even where we have data, sometimes we don't always utilize it adequately, and that's the third challenge area that we've articulated here. We see a lot of folks trying to use data where they can, but sometimes folks are being pulled in different directions. That happens both at a state and a community level. And so often what we see is that there's an underutilization of the data that we do have to inform policy change in local practice. And that's both like I said, that's a time pressure, that's a capacity challenge, and that is, just a range of priorities pulling on folks in different directions. And so we think that there could be a significant amount of work to improve what folks have access to and consistently utilize to inform their work. And then finally, we see the state as sometimes being under-equipped for equity. What we mean by that is that even though we have a lot of shared goals around equity and driving more access and inclusion in our systems, there are gaps between those goals and what we are able to do locally and at the statewide level, because leaders are unevenly equipped to operationalize that in policy and practice. And that is also informed by the broader federal policy environment around things like affirmative action, et cetera. Folks often feel paralyzed by broader dialogue and broader policy constraints around how you can apply an equity lens to your work and operationalize equity in terms of how we're directing resources and how we're designing our policies and practices. So what are we aiming for in policy evaluation and continuous improvement? One, we want to see more statewide research, a statewide research agenda and governance, right? So we want to see our education and workforce agency hold a shared and funded research agenda, shared and funded. Important that those both exist. that the research agenda and governance structure both that those are shared and funded adequately to systematically examine the efficacy and equity of our statewide policies and programs. Secondly, that we have a data-informed continuous improvement process. By that, we mean that community and statewide leaders systematically engage with quantitative and qualitative data to understand what students are experiencing and implement continuous improvement processes. And that is in service of equitable student access and outcomes. In terms of levers that we've articulated here, again, this is not necessarily the full universe of potential things that could drive us towards those aims, but a handful that we want to articulate here. First, that we should have a community-informed state research agenda. It's valuable to have a state research agenda that's held by the state agency partners, but that should be informed by what communities are often asking about and trying to figure out about what's happening in their local context. We hear all the time from community leaders, how do we know what's happening with our students once they graduate from high school, beyond what's available in National Student Clearinghouse data? And a broader system-wide vision for data and research agenda that's funded and supported should be driven by those types of questions so that the statewide systems are aligned to enhancing what the local leaders can do in their context. Secondly, that we need consistent state funding and governance for integrating data for longitudinal purposes, right? The Illinois longitudinal data system sets up certain aspects of this, but we need more systematic funding and consistent and systematic funding and governance for managing that, for managing those data securely, for ensuring that those data can be linked in order for us to conduct the types of analyses that would be articulated in a state research agenda. And then finally, that we need more college and career readiness policy evaluations. The Postsecondary Workforce and Workforce Readiness Act is just about 9 years old at this point. There's a lot of robust implementation in place, but we need to look at how that's working, right? We anecdotally have heard from a lot of districts around some of the challenges that implementation processes have caused or have presented for them as they are looking to implement these valuable strategies for their students. And so how do we examine how both the processes themselves as well as the implementation are shaping who's getting access to these different levers and what's happening ultimately with those students? Some preliminary examination of college and career pathway endorsement data signals to us that endorsements are very unevenly available across our state, and that is likely due to resource inequities that the state has been grappling with through the evidence-based funding formula for years now. But how do we really systematically evaluate and examine that in order to ensure that we're able to refine policies with an eye towards improving them and improving student access and success? Which brings us to our final pillar area, which is future readiness. And the core challenges in the future readiness pillar area are, one, evolving job markets, right? So the future of work is always changing. You're often hearing in the news about, the jobs of tomorrow, what's going to happen. We don't necessarily know we can't predict everything. And our existing systems are often tied to outdated notions of what it means to navigate the job market. And we don't necessarily know what the job market will look like and what it will mean to navigate that in the longer term for our current students. And secondly, that technology is always evolving. AI is the current flavor of this, right? But emerging technologies evolve quickly, and they really do shape how learners are accessing and participating in and learning through education and career programming. I'm sure those of you on the line are constantly grappling with this in the education space, right? How do we ensure that technology change doesn't leave certain students behind and can really enhance learning as much as possible? So what are our aims in this arena here? One, we should be focused as much as possible on adaptive and skills-based education, right? So all Illinois learners should be equipped with essential and technical employability skills that empower them to be adaptive and prepare them for a range of future employment opportunities. I think, what sticks out to me is often when you ask many folks, who are on the line here, people's career pathways are not necessarily a straight line, right? So how do we enable young people who are currently in our systems to be adaptive to the range of ebb and flow and windy pathways that they may experience down the line? Secondly, we want to leverage technology for student success. So we want to see that community and state leaders can leverage emerging technologies to enhance access to and success in college and career preparation for all learners, and particularly those from historically marginalized communities. We want to see how we can leverage that technology to close gaps rather than to widen them. So the two primary policy levers that we've articulated in this space are one that our state should be prioritizing that we proactively research and develop guidance for integrating these new technologies into the educational infrastructure and pedagogy, right? So instead of being caught on our heels, how do we have a more proactive look at what is coming down the pipeline and how that can and should be informing our work and enhancing educational leaders in their work. We think that the governor's education cabinet that we described previously could have a standing committee on this, right? And really focused in on what does it mean to keep an eye on new technologies, integrating learning from leaders in the technological space, but also in close collaboration with practitioners and leaders in secondary, post-secondary, other parts of the education pipeline to really right-size recommendations that can go both up to the governor's office and state agencies, but also out to educational leaders in the state broadly around how they can leverage these different technologies for supporting their students. And secondly, we need to find different ways of funding and incentivizing participation in interdisciplinary and skills-based models. Again, recognizing we're in a resource-constrained environment, but how do we use our funding and other incentive structures, whether that's like GPA or other levers within our system, to incentivize student participation in opportunities like robust work-based learning, which helps them develop not only technical employability skills in that particular area, but also really cross-cutting employability skills that'll serve them regardless of where they end up down the line. And so, just thinking about what are the ways that we can envision that our system can better align to incentivizing participation in these models that we have lots of examples of in the state of really robust programming. And so how do we incentivize participation in that and scaling that up?
Thank you for taking time to hear from us. Please dig into the full narrative and reach out with any follow-up questions or opportunities. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.